There are a lot of points in life where you can be struggling with something or you find yourself in a impossible situation, but after today's story, you're going to see that hope can be the actual key to survival. On October 11th, 1972, a flight would take off from Uruguay carrying 45 passengers. Of these passengers, most of them were young adults and teenagers, and they were all part of a rugby team. And their destination was Chile, where they had a rugby match the following day. As they got to their cruising altitude, shortly into their flight, right above the clouds, they would start to hit some turbulence. Now, turbulence is pretty normal during flights, unless you're one of those flyers that are really skittish and it might freak you out a little bit. But it's typically a very normal thing. Now, when this flight hit that air pocket and caused that initial turbulence, the plane would actually drop about 300 feet, and from there it would actually meet with another air pocket. And this is when everything would turn kind of grim for the crew and the passengers on the plane, as this next air pocket caused them to drop below the cloud level. It was at this point that Nando Parrado would turn to his friend Abal and say, "Hey, are we supposed to be flying that close to the mountains?" Outside of their window, they could see the Andes Mountains about 10 to 20 feet away. It was after his friend responded with, "I don't think so," before Parrado's entire world just went completely black. By the time Parrado had awoken, 29 of the 45 passengers were the only ones remaining alive. At this moment, those who were strong and able were tending to the wounded and also building shelter from what was remaining of the plane, to include the seats and everything that was left of the fuselage. They started ripping off the metal of the back of the seats to be able to heat up the snow to create a steady stream of drinkable water. Now, it's to no surprise that food would be extremely scarce after a plane crash, especially when it was basically ripped in half. But Parrado would write in his journal that had survived the crash that during these initial few days, he had a single chocolate-covered peanut, and during day one, he would suck all the chocolate off of it, and over the next 3 days, he would simply just suck on the peanut and nibble on it when it was necessary. The freezing temperatures and just the harsh elements in general would start claiming more lives from these passengers that had survived the initial crash, and as this happened and people grew more hungry, those who had survived would start cutting off slices of the meaty parts of the body of those who had passed and just eat them in silence. Now, some would actually hold off in hopes that they would be rescued, but they did find a radio, and as they were listening in, they heard the Chile news broadcast say they had called off the search. Now, people were really defeated and didn't really see a light at the end of the tunnel after hearing this news, but somebody amongst the survivors said, "You know what, this is good news. This means we're going to get out of here on our own now." The survivors that remained would go day by day for about a week and a half, just trying to stay fed and trying to stay warm and alive, when an avalanche would occur that would claim 8 more lives and completely bury the shelter that they had had. It was after this avalanche that the survivors decided that they were going to put together a team to march out west over the peaks to see if they could find a sign of human life or any way to help them get rescued. This team was originally supposed to be 3 people, but it got downsized to 2 to save on resources, to include food and materials to keep warm. And this team of 2 was Parrado and Canessa. This team of 2 of Parrado and Canessa would set out, and they would somehow end up climbing about 15,000 feet up one of the peaks while fighting the blistering cold and altitude sickness. And when they got to the top, they looked around, and there really wasn't much. And Canessa would turn to Parrado and say, "Well, we came this far together. Now let's go die together." Parrado and Canessa would keep traveling through the mountainside, fighting off the bitter cold and the altitude sickness, and they weren't really finding any signs of human life. And they were about to just give up all hope until December 18th, when they heard the sound of rushing water and followed that noise down to a riverbank. On this riverbank, they found a old rusted soup can, a horseshoe, and some cow remains. They decided, we're going to follow this river some more. They followed this river until about the evening of December 20th, when they came across a man on horseback. Once they saw him, they kept on moving down, kind of walking alongside with him, even though he was on the opposite side of the river. And on the 21st of December, they discovered 3 men on horseback. Now, when they had discovered the 3 men on horseback, it had been 71 days since the initial crash. That being said, Parrado and Canessa and the rest of the survivors had survived in the harshness of the Andes Mountains for 71 days, and that is no minor feat. But once they came across these 3 men, Parrado tried to yell across the river, about what was going on, what they needed. They had people they needed to get rescued, but the sound of the river was just muffling his voice. So he started doing hand gestures and practically playing charades with these men across the river. He started to get scared that they would think he was just some sort of madman and just end up riding off. But that's not what happened. Instead, what happened is one of the men on horseback picked up a rock, wrote something down on a piece of paper, tied it to the rock, and threw it across the river. And on that note that was on the rock, it said, "Tell me what you want." As Parado read this note, he would start shaking either from the cold or from the joy or relief of possibly being rescued. But he would slowly jot down what had happened over the last 71 days and how there were 14 other survivors, aside from Parado and Canessa, that needed rescuing. And he was getting ready to throw the rock back when he started to doubt his own strength. Didn't think he had enough strength to be able to get the rock all the way back across. But mustering the last bit of strength he had, he hailed it right over the river, and it landed just on the bank, close enough to where one of the men could pick it up. After the man on the horseback read the note, he just held his hands up like he fully understood exactly what they needed. Shortly after the discovery by the riverside, Parado would join a couple of helicopters in the search of the other 14 survivors. While they were flying back up the mountain, it proved not to be an easy trip, with the turbulence and the wind constantly dropping and pushing the helicopter backwards. But they finally cleared one of the peaks when Parado would look over and see some black specks on the ground below him. The choppers, with their rotors still running, would land and pick up the rest of the survivors and fly them to a hospital in Chile where they would fully recover from all of their injuries. Over the course of 75 days, when this plane initially took off from Uruguay and was flying over the Andes Mountains, 45 of the passengers were alive and well. But after the crash and after these 75 days, only 16 of them would survive. This story is known as the Miracle of the Andes. It's going to be it for this story. There will be more coming in the following days, and I hope it's all that I picture it to be. So if you enjoyed today's story, I hope you enjoy any future ones. And until then, my friends, good night.